for all of us as industry leaders and as participants in this mortgage market, I'd be interested in your thoughts of what do you think the report from Treasury and the comments of the FHFA, what are they attempting to accomplish? But more importantly, what do you think they should be attempting to accomplish?
So look, I think there's been, as Michael points out, we're 10 years into this talking about GSE reform, and I think that this current iteration is another attempt to really get some clarity around what's going to happen with the GSEs. But I think that we would be terribly remiss if we took the primary market for granted and did anything that would interrupt the primary market. I mean, housing is a central part of our economy, and around that are FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. And so I think that there's a lot of talk going on, but I think that we have a working mortgage market. And I think that, when you read the Treasury report and you listen to others, really, I think what we're really striving for is alternative forms of liquidity, whether that's investment in interest rate risk or investment in credit risk. And I think that, in this feature over the last 10 years, we've seen the banks get more and more involved in terms of investing in mortgages. And I think that, anything that we can do to, for example, open up the home loan bank system to REITs adds another form of liquidity to the market. And I think that that's very, very important if you're looking to disperse the mortgage risk across the ecosystem.
I really think what the objective is, without putting myself in the director's shoes, is really focused heavily on safety and soundness. And there's probably a taxpayer panel someplace outside of this hotel that it's a completely different constituency with completely different priorities. So when we look at the market and we say everything's great, the mortgage market's never been more efficient, rates have been extremely attractive and housing has boomed now since the crisis. It all sounds good, but if you use today to stress test or think about whether or not today's market will hold up in a downturn, I think there's real questions, and I personally have pretty big reservations that it would. I think there should be more CRT, but I also think that when you look back at what happened in the crisis, ultimately the survivors, and Redwood was a survivor, we survived because of permanent capital. The CRT bid will move with the market, it will cycle. And I'm not sure how many in this room purchase B1s or B2s, but probably not many. There's still a lot of fast money involved, and I think to build a really durable market with real clearing levels, I think permanent capital is a big part of weathering the storm, and I think that's ultimately what the FHFA is focused on for Fannie and Freddie.
The first do no harm principle hasn't changed. Kind of hard to argue the other side of that, I think, perhaps. I think there are a couple of things. One, I think I would reiterate, your introductory comments, because typically these conversations begin with something needs to be done because the current state is unsustainable. And at every one of these panels, I say, unless you think 11 years is sustainable, then it's unsustainable. I think the other point that needs to be acknowledged, and typically GSE reform is part of the title of these conversations, is that there has been material GSE reform from the time of conservatorship to where we sit today, that the GSEs themselves as operating platforms have been materially de-risked through a host of steps. CRT has been regularly mentioned in this conversation. That is one. A change in their underwriting guides or material reduction in their retained portfolio is another. And so the conversation really is I would argue, focused on governance and structure going forward. Part and parcel of the first do no harm is a recognition that the government guarantee is what stabilized the markets when they first went into conservatorship. And the notion of making structural changes before assuring the certainty of that guarantee doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I think what the objectives should be, and we often lose sight of it because we spend a lot of time in the weeds, but the objective should be sustainable, affordable, and accessible mortgage credit to the markets that also protects the taxpayer going forward. Those should be the guiding principles. And I think they too often get lost in the conversation, and I'm not sure they are reflected in the report that came out.
So housing is an essential platform for families in this country to thrive. And home ownership is essential to have broad-based prosperity. So if we're in a period of economic growth, if we don't see that growth happening in a broad-based way among all of America's families, oftentimes one of the things you can look at is what is their housing situation. Housing is the biggest expense of most families, and the situation is not good right now. On the rental side, we are at all-time unaffordability highs. There is almost no city anywhere where the typical teacher, firefighter, police can afford a two-bedroom apartment. And when it comes to home ownership, though we have had a very workable and functioning mortgage market since the crisis, and both the GSEs and FHA stepped in when the private market pulled back, we haven't really been able to move the dial much on home ownership from where it went down to after the crisis. And particularly for people of color, and I have to particularly call out the African American families who are now at the same level of home ownership as they were when we passed the Fair Housing Act that outlawed racial discrimination. So this seems to me to be a pretty big problem from not just from a human perspective or a fairness perspective, but from a future economic growth perspective. And I have never understood why in this conversation we rarely talk about that, and when we're manipulating the plumbing, when we're figuring out, well, let's put this pipe here instead of here, we're not really talking about what's coming out at the end of all of those pipes. And I was struck by, in the Treasury report, by the complete lack of that conversation at all. If there is something broken, and I agree that on many perspectives it's hard to see exactly what's broken right now. If there is something what's broken is the result for the American family, who, by the way, is also the American taxpayer.
This is my frustration with 8 years of discussion over who should own Fannie Mae, is that when you have renters paying 50-60% of their income just to rent, the secondary market, of course, needs to function, and the primary market needs to function, but we are completely flipped on its head in terms of the amount of time we spend on sort of plumbing and ownership debates, and the amount of, and I'm guilty of this too, but of ink that's been spilled on white papers on that piece, at the lack of discussing about the fact that we have an actual deep housing affordability crisis in this country, and 20 basis points here or there and rate isn't the challenge. It's actually having sufficient supply and taking that issue head on.
The beautiful thing about going last is that every insightful, intelligent thing that can be said has already been said. So I would say that it is missing the point. GSE reform is missing the point. As Kevin said, first do no harm. The market is functioning. They comprise more of the origination market combined with FHA and VA than they ever have. So if you're trying to reform something that is clearly not broken and is clearly sustainable, it seems that you would want to fix, as David said, the other liquidity outlets that are available just in case you get it wrong. So doing things that will make PLS a vibrant, sustainable force again, I think should be the first order of priority, because if you break it, there is no net to catch the borrowers that have access to credit today, and the only real engine for expanding credit is the private market. So just their orders of priority are screwed up, and the focus of administrative reform, to Kevin's point, should be to shrink the footprint, provide access to efficient, low-cost financing through the Federal Home Loan Bank, opening access to the Federal Home Loan Bank system. And then we can worry about, who get, the escape or release from conservatorship once we have a, relatively stable foundation away from the GSEs.